Okay, folks, we're back with our second benchmark lesson in our populations and communities and interactions among living things activity list, which is part of our ecology unit. So, our first benchmark had us talking about defining what an organism is and finding out how an organism fits in its environment, right? Whether it's a population of all the same organism or a community full of different organisms or all of the living and non-living things in an area, right? Or all of that plus the area on the biosphere that it's located in and then the entire biosphere, right? And also talking about how populations can change and what are some factors that can cause populations to change, whether it's birth rates, death rates, immigration, emigration, right? Or how the resources that are in a particular environment can affect the population. And we brought up the idea of carrying capacity last time, right? The limit of how big a population can get based on resources that are available. Now, after that minute long recap, we're going to move on to how living things interact with each other in the environment. So let's start this off by talking about what a niche is. All right, and a niche is the role that an organism plays in its habitat. All right, where it's living and how it participates in that area that it's living, and sort of how it lives its life. That's an organism's niche. All right. So sometimes different organisms have the same niche or niche. You can call it either one. And when that happens, we have this idea of natural selection. All right, and this is a process by which the organisms, right, that are best prepared to live in their habitat are the ones that get to live and reproduce and have offspring that have the same advantage, right? All of that is a very wordy way of saying evolution. And that's the word that so many people talk about, but not a lot of people have a good understanding of what it means. Right? It means that that living thing, that organism, has some traits, has some characteristics that allow it to have an advantage where it lives so that it outcompetes other organisms in its habitat and survives to make more of itself. And I have a really great example here of these moths. You'll see this picture. This is a very interesting story about the Industrial Revolution. So we have these peppered moths here. And during the time before the Industrial Revolution in England, right, when factories started building many, many things and essentially burning coal and polluting the atmosphere, we had these moths, either the darker version or the lighter version, okay? That the two different colors of the same species, one color would be found in greater numbers than the other. And before the Industrial Revolution, they would rest on these birch trees. And birch trees have these white bark all the way around it. And whenever these moths would land on the white birch tree, the darker colored moths would show up more and would get eaten more by birds. So you would have a natural selection where the white moths would actually survive better because they blended in with the bark of the birch tree. But then you had the Industrial Revolution happen. And when that occurred, the bark of the birch tree would get dirty with soot from the factory. And the result of that is that the darker colored moths would blend in better with the soot covered tree bark than the lighter color. They would get picked off by birds easier, the lighter colored moths would. And so that actually created a sort of an unnatural selection, right? It was humans that forced that change. And we call those changes adaptations, right? When there's a difference between species or an organism, and one of them is more adapted to living in its environment. Right? So we'll talk now about adaptations. These are behaviors and characteristics that are inherited by an organism that make them have an advantage over other organisms in the same niche or niche. Okay. And adaptations can take a number of different forms, one of which are structural adaptations. And these are physical body parts that help living things survive in their environment. Turtle shells are a great structural adaptation. Bird beaks, if you look over here, right? All of these different shaped bird beaks allow these birds to reach and access their food source, or break apart a nut, or reach into a hole and grab a grub that help them have an advantage over other birds or other organisms that are in the same niche as them. Right, there's a really famous story about Darwin's finches. The islands in the Galapagos have all of these different varieties of finches that look like they were once part of the same species, but because of where they lived, on which island they lived, their different food sources, they had to adapt their beak shape to be able to get to their food source. Other structural adaptations include rabbit ears, right? Really tall, really wide, able to rotate them so that they can hear. Cactus spines. Cool fact, cactus spines are really tightly rolled up and help with the transpiration or the water saving of the cactus. But the spines obviously also are a deterrent, right, from other organisms hurting them. Right? And then the broad leaves of rainforests. If you've ever seen pictures of rainforests or videos of rainforests, those leaves are really wide, right, to capture as much rain as possible and to get as much sunlight as possible, because forests in the rainforests are very dense, right? So these trees need to compete to get as much sunlight and resources as possible because there's so many trees around. Another kind of adaptation is a behavioral adaptation. Right? So different birds in the same niche develop bird calls that are distinctive, that can be heard between birds of the same species so that there's no confusion. Or if there's a competition for resources, you can have some organisms hibernate or rest during certain times of the year so that other organisms can sort of alternate the use of resources. And you have bird migration for the same reason, right? When the weather changes, birds migrate to look for greater sources of food to help them survive in their groups. We also have some examples of competition creating adaptations. A famous example is that of warblers, which are different kinds of species of bird that actually live in different parts of the same tree so that they're not competing for the same resources. We also have organisms that live and are awake at different times of the day or night. So we have organisms that live during the day, they're called diurnal, versus organisms that are awake during the nighttime, those are nocturnal. Okay. And then not only do we have different physical locations where animals decide to live so that they're not in competition, or different times of the day or night where they are awake and functional, but we also have different times of the year or just different years. All right, and cicadas are a really great example of that because they don't want to have too much competition between other species of cicada. They've actually developed 13 and 17 year cicadas, so they bury themselves in the ground and they stay there for long periods of time, but they come out on alternating odd years so that there isn't an overwhelming number and there's too much competition to get resources. And we also have animals and organisms that have adaptations in order to be a predator or to adapt to being a prey or avoid being a prey. Right? So an organism that hunts and kills other organisms is called a predator. Right? And predators have adaptations which help them become better at hunting and killing other organisms. Plants, you wouldn't think that there are predatory plants, but we have Venus flytraps and suncatchers. Right? You're familiar with the Venus flytrap, right? It has the two sort of lobes of the plant with these spines that look like teeth. All right, and they have little sensory cells in them that when an organism like a fly or other insect lands on those little teeth, that the fly trap closes, all right, and traps the organism there, the insect, and dissolves them with enzymes that it secretes and basically absorbs the nutrients from it. And sun catchers also do the same thing. All right, instead they actually have this area down below that attracts the flies and other insects to come down, and once they get down there they can't get back up, and they end up secreting these enzymes that dissolve the insects and they absorb the nutrients there. You also have predator adaptations like echolocation. All right, think about a bat using echolocation to hunt for food. It's a highly specific and very it's a very sensitive technology that bats use by echoing their own sound waves, these clicks and squeaks that help them to bounce those sound waves off of other insects like moths in the evenings and nighttime to help them be able to find them in the dark. You have a lot of predators that rely on their speed, some that rely on poisons, right? All to help them adapt to becoming better predators to get the resources that they need to be able to, like I said, with what it means to be a living organism, to be able to grow and to be able to reproduce. Right? We also have organisms that get hunted or killed, and those are called prey. And even prey have created adaptations to help them survive so that they don't become prey. A skunk's spray is another great example of an adaptation that an organism has that prevents it from being killed. Warning colors, if you've ever seen poison dart frogs, they have these really bright red and blue and yellow colors that are basically telling any predator that it's not a very good idea to try to eat them because they'll get very sick or worse. You have protective coverings like a turtle shell, which is a great adaptation for an organism that might be hunted. And then you have the ability to pretend that you look like another organism or have camouflage. A viceroy is a great example of mimicry because a viceroy looks just like a monarch butterfly. Many species of bird don't eat monarch butterflies because monarch butterflies eat milkweed, which is a plant that the butterflies use, the monarch butterflies use for nutrients, but it creates this nasty taste for any bird that eats them. And so many times a monarch butterfly will be left alone because the bird knows that it tastes terrible. A viceroy is a kind of butterfly that mimics or looks just like a monarch butterfly, except it doesn't eat milkweed and it doesn't taste terrible if it gets eaten by a bird, but birds still avoid the viceroy because it looks too much like a monarch butterfly to take a chance. Right? And another great example of an adaptation by a prey is zebra stripes. Right? So zebras run together in packs, and their stripes help them to blend in when they're running away from a predator. And as they all start moving in different directions together to get away from the predator, that blending of stripes confuses the predator and oftentimes help them get away. So that is an adaptation from zebras and why zebras have their stripes. Below here you have a relationship between predator and prey. We call these predator-prey cycles. So we have an example here of a snowshoe hare and a lynx. Right? A hare is another way of saying a kind of rabbit. Right? So this is the rabbit, and a lynx is a cat-like animal. Right? And these are animals that live in cold, snowy areas. But you'll notice that the population of the lynx is the red population here. Right? It goes up and down in a very specific pattern related to how many of the hare population there are. Right? So if we have a big growth in the hare population, All right, you'll see that the lynx population starts to grow. And when the hare population starts to decrease because there's too many lynx eating them, right, then you'll see that the lynx population will start to decline because they're running out of hare to eat. So there's this kind of a sensitive balance where you have the available resources to a predator, right, determining how many of that predator can live. And then when that number of predator goes down, the number of prey goes up. And then when the number of prey go up, then the number of predators go up, which makes the number of prey go down, which makes the number of predators go down. That is a predator-prey cycle. Finally, we have adaptations due to something called symbiosis. And symbiosis is a way of saying that there is a close relationship between two species that benefits at least one of those species. Okay? The first kind of symbiotic relationship that we're going to talk about is called a mutualism. Okay? In a mutualistic relationship, both species or both organisms benefit. So, really great example are a rhinoceros and oxpeckers. Those are birds. So you'll see oftentimes a rhino in the wild will have birds all over its back, right? And those birds are helping keep the flies away because they're eating them, right? So the oxpecker birds get food while the rhino gets all of those pesky insects away from its ears and eyes and help it to be able to see its environment without being bothered by bugs. All right, a really famous example of a mutualistic relationship is the clownfish and sea anemone, right? That was from the movie Finding Nemo, right? The clownfish gets a safe home and an environment to live in, and it also keeps predators away from the sea anemone. So they have a mutualistic relationship. You have a mutualistic relationship with all of these teeny bugs in your eyelashes at this very moment called mites. I know it sounds really gross, but there are teeny tiny insects crawling on your eyelashes. They eat the dead skin cells that are all over your eyelashes and eyebrows as you blink. And so they benefit by having something to eat, and you as a human benefit by having another organism clean that area for you. And another one of the famous examples of a mutualistic relationship are ants and the acacia tree. The acacia tree is a very easy to recognize tree if you were to Google it. The ants that are crawling all over it get a safe place to live in this acacia tree. And strangely, the bacteria that are on the ants stop bacteria that would normally grow on the acacia tree and harm it from growing. So, in fact, it's not even really the ants that are helping, it's the bacteria on the ants that are helping the acacia tree. But still a mutualistic relationship. Another kind of a symbiotic relationship is called commensalism. Okay? And commensalism is a relationship where one species benefits from the relationship and the other one doesn't really care. A famous example is the remora fish and sharks. So if you see a shark swimming in the water on TV or maybe even in an aquarium or real life, you'll often see these other small fish sort of swimming near the shark so that when the shark eats, it's kind of a sloppy eater, and a lot of the bits of the food that it doesn't eat sort of fly off next to it as it swims. The remora fish get food, right, from the leftovers of the shark. In this case, the shark doesn't really care that the remora fish are there, but the remora fish benefit. All right. Another example are the burdock plants, the plants that have the sticky little seeds that get stuck on your clothes. Well, that's an adaptation from the plant to stick to animals with fur. All right, as the animals with fur like deer or other forest-dwelling animals walk by these plants, those seeds, the burdock seeds, stick to the animal's fur, and they walk until essentially they fall off again. And that's an adaptation that plants have developed to help spread their seeds because plants typically don't get up and start moving, right? And they can't make more plants if they can't get their seeds to go from one place to another, right? So burdock plants do so by sticking to animals. Tree frogs in trees are another great example of commensalism, right? The tree does not care that the tree frog is there, but the tree frog gets a form of shelter. So commensalism is one species benefits, the other one doesn't care. And finally, the last example or type of symbiosis that we have is called parasitism. All right, and that's a relationship where one species benefits and the other one is harmed. Okay? So think about an insect like a tick. Right? We call, in every case of parasitism, we call the organism that is benefiting the parasite, and the organism that is harmed the host. All right, so in this case, other animals like deer and sometimes humans or dogs or cats can get ticks on them. Right? The tick bites through the skin of the organism and it drinks the blood. Right? And the other organism, whether it be a person or a dog or a deer, right, has any number of other illnesses that come along with having a tick on them, affect them, they're harmed. And you have other species of animal and insects that harm their hosts, such as tapeworms or fleas. And so parasitism is, again, a type of symbiotic relationship where one species benefits and the other one is harmed. And finally, we're going to wrap up our benchmark here talking about changes that happen in communities. Right? And you'll remember from the beginning of our first benchmark on the organization of an ecosystem or the ecological organization, right? That a community are all of the different species that live together in an area. So succession occurs when you have a series of predictable changes that occur in a habitat over time. And we have two different kinds of succession. We have primary succession, which happens where we have a change that occurs in a space where there was no soil or living things existing there. So anytime you get like a glacier moving and scraping up all of the soil and anything that was there, or you have a volcanic eruption that covers everything and lava that cools off and covers it in a layer of rock. Over time, that area that was scraped by the glacier or the area that was covered in lava that cooled to be rock will eventually have soil grow there, and then you'll end up with plants starting to grow there, starting with grasses and then shrubs and then trees, and then you'll have animals start to populate those areas. We call that primary succession. Secondary succession are changes that occur in these habitats where there already is soil and living things. And examples of that are when we have a fire or something occur, right, in that area. It may burn down all of the plants that are there, and the animals may go away, but the soil is still there. And so it starts over a shorter period of time. The soil starts to recover from the event, and then you end up with grasses growing, and then smaller trees and shrubs, and then bigger trees, and throughout that time animals begin to populate. So these are just changes that occur in a habitat or an area over time where there either was soil in the case of secondary succession, or there was no soil or living things existing there in the case of primary succession. All right, thanks guys.